thought I'd open by saying a little bit about how I came to write this book, China's Futures. I became dissatisfied in the 1990s, 2000s, and beyond with a lot of predictions people in the West, specialists on China, even in China too, are making about China's future, whether positive or negative, always linear and certain. There can be only one future. It'll be either disastrous, it'll be fantastic. In any case, only one. And I began to wonder whether we might stretch this out and imagine a future trajectory in which a country oscillates from one kind of extreme to another. So to give two examples, the two examples that I'll talk about today, let's take the economy in China. There's time going down there along the left-hand axis, farther into the future. We can imagine the economic sector, if you can see down there in the bottom left, that's reform. And the bottom right of the economic sector is status quo. So you can imagine over the next 10 years or so, China oscillating, sometimes moving toward the status quo, not pursuing economic reform of the sort that Chinese economists have been saying for at least a decade or so China needs really badly, then maybe moving more in the direction of reform, then moving back, so on, that kind of thing. We can imagine the same sort of oscillation in foreign policy. We can imagine the same sort of thing in foreign policy. We can, on the bottom left there of foreign policy is caution. Bottom right is ambitiousness. Okay, so we can imagine, in fact, we've seen since 2009 Chinese foreign policy becoming more ambitious in places like the South China Sea, East China Sea, but we can also imagine it moving back toward a more cautious direction. And ultimately, we can try to imagine the interaction between these two, and that's what I'll be getting to a little bit later today. So the key question that emerges from this research that I did and eventuated in the book is, why has China's foreign and security policy become significantly more ambitious since 2009? That's so-called new assertiveness, so which, by the way, people in China use terminology people in China use too. It's not a Western imposition. The new assertiveness since 2009. Why have we seen this change, even as, I realize you can't see that very clearly, even as economic performance, even as economic performance, still not working. Hold on, I'm just going to use the, even as economic performance and the economic, demographic, environmental outlook have been deteriorating and continue to do so, as I'll show you. And then what are the implications for China's future trajectory or the course it might trace between those barriers, those boundaries? So what were the core findings then of this book, China's Futures? First, nearly all the PRC economists I surveyed, I spent several years actually reading in Chinese economists, political scientists, international relations specialists, whether in academia, think tanks, People's Liberation Army, government, so on, a lot of different units, a lot of different institutions. Then I followed up with interviews to make sure I was understanding the Chinese perspective on China's possible trajectories. And I found, first of all, and this kind of surprised me, nearly all the PRC economists I read agreed as early as 2007, before the global financial crisis, and then of course increasingly since then, that China's economic future will be dark in the absence of fundamental reforms, partly because the economic problems now coming on stream are intersecting with demographic and environmental problems. But concrete economic interest groups identified by many of those economists, people in the real estate sector, property development, so on, benefiting from current arrangements do not agree. Also, about 3/4 of international relations analysts in academia, think tanks, People's Liberation Army, and more, by the way, I'm sure this excludes every international relations specialist here today, they seemed blissfully unaware, and I chose that term carefully, of the economic problems. And would dismiss their significance in interviews. I mean, at one time I went into an interview in a certain university and I said, well, what about the demographic problems? And the international relations professor said, you don't have to worry about demographic problems because Chinese peasants will always be Chinese peasants. Even after they move to the cities, you relax the one-child policy, they'll still produce 5, 6, 7 children. I said, well, but you know, it's not just the one-child policy. Don't worry, it won't be a problem. Foreigners just have a hard time understanding China. And I said, but this is actually Chinese demographers. He didn't want to keep on talking about it. So I found it was amazing to me, really, that only about 3/4 of China's international relations specialists across all sectors seemed even to be aware of the serious economic problems that I'm now about to outline, but which I'm pretty sure you already know about. Okay, so this is going to feed into the shift to that more assertive foreign policy in 2009. There's a disconnect that develops, and that's what I'm having a hard time understanding. And so who then would have, who now does have, who will have the ear of the top leadership? Will it be the economists who are warning of dire consequences, increasingly warning of dire consequences, if serious fundamental reforms, such as privatizing state-owned enterprises, aren't pursued? Or will it be the international relations folks who, at least as of a year or so ago, still were denying the economic problems and the demographic and environmental problems are so serious? The jury still out, of course. We're oscillating, and there's no equilibrium point. We can't predict. It's complex. We have to watch and see. We don't know. We don't know within either of these boundaries which way we'll go, and we don't know how we'll interact. Okay, so briefly, the new assertiveness. Of course, it's mostly taking place in the South China Sea, also the East China Sea. Just going to point, I'm not going to try to point with this because it ended up changing. See the PRC Islands up there? It's the bottom one, right, Craig? That's the top one. You can't see the PRC Islands below Hainan, east of Hainan Island. PRC or Shisha Islands there. Just want to point that out to you. And the Spratly Islands down there, and the, which one was it? That one there, okay. Right, so the Paracel you want to remember, and the Spratly for just a second. Paracels are where in July 2012, China elevated a place called Sansha, kind of three pieces of rock, basically, three islets on Yongxing Island, or Woody Island, to a prefectural level city under Hainan province, sort of to serve as the capital, under Hainan, of course, of the South China Sea. They held a grand opening ceremony for the elevation of this place to a prefectural level city. You can see how festive it was and so on. And actually just last weekend I went to a conference at the Carter Center in Atlanta and sat next to the head of a new think tank on the South China Sea from China. He said there are now about 1,000 PRC citizens living and working in Sansha. He was very proud of the creation of all those new islands we've seen in the last 2 years or so out of islets. He was proud of the technology that allowed for that to happen. He said he hopes some of those will be populated by people working and living there soon. He also said the seafood is really good in Sansha, and so I asked him, could I come and visit sometime? He said, well, it probably wouldn't be very convenient right now. I'm sure you've seen photographs of turning islets into islands. In some cases, they have led to extending airport facilities, runway facilities, so that military aircraft could land, but also civilian supply craft. And I'm not going to go over this. It's just to point out, actually, if you go back to November 2002, the China Association of Southeast Asian Nations Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, it's pretty much a dead letter. If you look at the, if you see what's outlined there in blue, the parties reaffirm their respect and commitment to freedom of navigation and overflight over the South China Sea. Well, the United States just challenged that a couple of days ago, and PRC is really angry about that. They agreed to work through international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The Philippines has taken China to court under international law of the sea. China has rejected that applies. And they also agreed not to conduct exercise self-restraint, conducting activities that would complicate or escalate disputes, especially building things on islands. Now, all the countries, all the claimants have built things on islands, but nobody has done it so quickly and in such an impressive, really, way as China in the last 2 years. So that's the basis for saying China is on a risk-seeking path, actually, in international relations, especially in the South China Sea. So risk has been on, I think, reflecting the influence of these international relations specialists who, again, are also in the People's Liberation Army and who don't recognize the serious economic problems. You would think you wouldn't want your foreign policy to be risky and risk-seeking if you're facing serious environmental, demographic, and economic problems. That's what we've seen. Occasionally, we'll see a timeout and consolidation, but then it's resumed again. So there's this discrepancy. What explains it? First, let's remind ourselves that after China entered the World Trade Organization in late 2001, it became heavily dependent on net exports to increase GDP, gross domestic product, every year. You can't actually see that literally in this graph, but you can see China's growing trade surplus throughout the 2000s. That left it extraordinarily vulnerable when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009. And actually, as you can see, China's trend line of exports has never recovered from the global financial crisis, so it's hobbling around down there where it says nominal data and did not pick up where it left off after the GFC ended. If you look both imports and exports, a longer term from 2010 down to today, they've been on a downward trend, not only because prices have fallen for commodities, but for other reasons too. As you know, China responded to the global financial crisis by, in 2009, embarking upon an enormous monetary, mostly stimulus program. And so in 2009 to 10, the People's Bank of China arranged for issuing new money and new loans amounting to all the new money and loans issued in the previous 4 years combined. So that explains, you can see M1 and M2 there, the surge there. That's going to cause all kinds of problems that the economists, who already in 2007, 2008 were worried about, became really even more worried about, and now are wringing their hands because it's set in motion a chain of events that will be really difficult to escape. Okay, first of all, it worsened the problem of over-reliance on investment to maintain the existing structure of GDP and to cause GDP to grow. This is a little bit, upon first glance, a little difficult to read, but see where it says RS, that's obviously the right-hand side, right-hand scale. You see real GDP growth there, year over year official data. Then, though, on the left-hand scale and the blue line, you see investment as a percentage of GDP. Now, investment, consumption, government spending, and net exports, add those together, you get GDP. See, in 2000, investment as a percentage of GDP in China was about 35%. By 2011, especially after that stimulus surge in 2009-10, surged almost 50%. As you probably know, by comparison, in the United States, consumption, flipping it around, consumption contributes 70% to GDP. So China is almost historically low in terms of the contribution of consumption to GDP. Now the problem is you can only invest so much, and then eventually you run out of viable projects. You begin investing in shopping malls that people don't frequent. You invest in hotels, people don't stay in apartment buildings, productive capacity that can never be utilized. And in order to undertake that investment, you have to take out loans, hoping that you'll generate revenue from the activities that will take place in your new factory or hotel or whatever. But if you don't generate those revenues, you can't pay back the loans. The only solution is to take out new loans to keep covering the old loans and take out new ones again, sort of like maxing out a credit card, then getting another one. You know, that kind of thing has been what's going on. So it now takes a lot more by means of issuing new credit or new money into the economy to cause GDP to grow by 1 percentage point. So you can see there in 2005-2008 period, there's a pretty healthy relationship. You would increase the money supply by so much, GDP would grow by a little bit more thanks to a small multiplier effect. The surge there in 2009 reflects just a sudden increase in money and credit flowing through the economy. The CCP then reins that in, but then look after 2011. What happens is CCP goes back to the well again and again, trying to use the old mechanism of sending money from state-owned banks through state-owned enterprises into investment projects to keep GDP growth at 7% or higher. But they have to keep issuing more and more money, more and more credit to get that incremental increase, 1 percentage point increase in GDP. It's not working as well as it was before. Something's broken. And over time, this can only lead to increasing debt. In 2007, the debt to GDP ratio in China was about 140%. By May of this year, it had risen to 282%. 282%, it's a very rapid increase. Most of it's actually corporate debt, unlike in some other countries like the United States where we worry about government debt. Corporate debt, even private sector debt to GDP is really high, and it's, again, people are building projects, companies are building projects, not generating revenues to pay back the loans, so you got to take out more loans to cover the old loans and so on. So here is China in comparison to certain other economies. This is actually corporate debt alone, so corporate debt to GDP, 151%. It's mid-2013. You see it higher than any of the countries, or Hong Kong's on here too, Singapore, Malaysia, UK, Japan, on this particular, it's way up there. Then finally, in terms of debt, the United States, at the peak of its housing bubble there in 2005, had a residential housing value relative to GDP of what, 1.78, maybe 2? And you know how catastrophic it was when the U.S. housing bubble collapsed for the U.S. economy. Japan in the late 1980s, you see how high it was, residential housing value relative to GDP. Well, China is, as of 2011, before prices started stabilizing, approaching Japan levels. So the Chinese economy is heavily dependent on high residential housing prices, actually high commercial real estate prices too. So if that bubble collapses, it probably, ceteris paribus, will be much more damaging to China's economy than the collapse of the U.S. housing bubble was to the United States after 2006, 7, 8. So, what we see here actually, though, in terms of do we reform, do we maintain the status quo, we see a kind of double helix. Because you see one step toward timidly, maybe seriously reforming, such as by liberalizing interest rates, but then a step back, emphasizing the central importance of state-owned enterprises, and we won't privatize those. Yeah, and then step forward, step back. Since May, we've been on a step back. For May, the central government was going to not allow local governments to keep on borrowing money to pay off their debts accumulated in 2009 and 2010. It changed its mind quietly in May of this year. And in other ways, too, the central government's backed down from reform. We're actually on a blue cycle now, somewhat boldly flirting with we're now timidly refraining from seriously reforming. Maybe we'll move back to somewhat boldly flirting with serious reform, but these two are tightly integrated, and so it's hard to imagine a breakthrough. Now, I just want to look at one more economic chart with you, really, because it really illustrates the problem of the old mechanism is broken. The state-owned banks issuing credit through state-owned enterprises, which then invest and cause GDP to grow or maintain the existing structure of GDP. Here, the black line you see is official GDP figures on the left-hand scale. See, they bounce around during the global financial crisis. But the dotted line we'll ignore energy for a while. The dotted line there is rail freight traffic. And I don't know how clear you can see this in the back, but rail freight traffic follows closely GDP growth all the way until you get to 2012, 2013. Then you see rail freight traffic, actually dips 5%. And then it goes up again. And then up again barely over 0. Then it dips another 5%, then up, then it dips. Actually, this year it's fallen by 20%. What's going on there is in the spring of 2012, 2013, 2014, there's a mini stimulus program pushed by the central government that led to investment, the whole cycle, and rail freight volume, because that means shipping commodities to factories and goods to stores and so on. That picked up again, but it only lasted for a while. And we're back down in this is really cataclysmic right here. I mean, this is really terrible. So we've seen a collapse, actually, in manufacturing growth. And I'm worried we're seeing a collapse in the existing structure of manufacturing. Have to go through pretty quickly here. Fortunately, services, at least according to PMI data and other indicators like this, are doing fairly well. All right, let me just make a final point here. All this is happening at just the wrong time. Because as you know, the Chinese population has just entered the phase of rapid aging that we've been anticipating for a long time. So you can see there on the right that the number of Chinese 20 to 29-year-olds, in other words, people entering the labor force or maybe applying to study at USC, peaked in 2015 and will now fall sharply. The total workforce will peak in the early 2020s and then decline. Okay, it's hard to grow GDP when the workforce is declining, especially because we also know the population is going to be aging rapidly. And so fewer and fewer younger people have to take care of more and more older people. And I know you can't possibly read this from afar. What it shows is that pollution probably turned health indicators significantly worse starting in about 2005. This is some data I gathered in Hong Kong back in the spring. This shows, I can't even read it myself, but this is cardiac disease in Tianjin in a sample. And this is males and females, 45 to 54, 55 to 64, and so on up. You can't see it clearly, but it's not linear, but there have been increases since 2005 and for all those categories over 45. You see something similar with lung cancer, although you really have to look at some of these mini volumes on epidemiology and demography they publish in China to really. So what's going on here is that people born in 1950, starting in 2005, the death rates for those people in certain categories over 55, certain sub-cohorts started increasing. Okay, that's really beyond tragic. To imagine the already broken traditional Chinese family with fewer cousins, fewer uncles, fewer sisters and brothers. Now if grandparents or even parents are getting cancer at 55, and those people were born in 1950 before the bad environmental problems began, what about people born in 1990? So why the risky foreign policy? Why the One Belt, One Road project? Why not instead invest these resources into cleaning up the environment, taking care of old people? What explains this discrepancy? And this is where I'll conclude. I think there's 4 possibilities, and then I'll sit down and we can debate later. Insufficient appreciation of the seriousness of the economic, demographic, and environmental problems at the very top. Seems unlikely because you think the very top leaders will be very well informed, but it's a possibility we have to put out there. The foreign and security policy establishment, as you know, the People's Liberation Army answers directly to the party general secretary, not to the government. It, below the very top, may fail to understand the seriousness of these problems. And it could be the top leaders understand, but they need to court the support of those foreign and security policy figures in order to pursue their other objectives, like crackdown on corruption. 3, everyone may be in agreement about the seriousness of the problems, and even that a middle income trap, that's where the rise stops. China ends up like Thailand or another Latin American country, doesn't break through to a high income country. Lo Jiwei, the finance minister, said in April of this year, there's only a 50-50 chance China will escape that by 2020. But this suggests it would be logical. This is kind of paradoxical. It suggests it might be logical to make ambitious foreign policy moves now, while China still is held in awe before most people realize this. Because a window of opportunity is closing. 10 years from now, China may not look as dynamic as it does now, so why not move now? And then last, could be everyone understands, it's not a window of opportunity question, but that everyone is resigned to a long deflationary reconstruction. It's unavoidable. And so the only question is how can we manage it as best we can so that, reduce the number of negative side effects. Still, though, I leave you with this question. How much can the country afford to invest in huge projects like One Belt, One Road, which is really still the same investment-led growth strategy, when the pollution problems are so bad, so serious, and are actually killing the population?